much. It's definitely an honor to be here with you all today. And I'd like to explore this question of, here we go, the happy brain, in terms of how do we acquire beneficial changes in that brain? In other words, how do we develop causes in the brain of lasting happiness, lasting well-being, especially in the face of life's difficulties? I'm going to focus on internal psychological causes of happiness, notably mental resources. Mental resources such as resilience, optimism, secure attachment, self-regulation, and self-worth. Much research shows that mental resources such as these have great influence over people's happiness, particularly when they're challenged by stressors. Across individuals, as we just heard, roughly a third to a half or so of the variation in psychological resources, including well-being as a psychological resource, are due to innate factors grounded in our DNA. That means, therefore, that the other roughly half to two-thirds of the variation in individual causes of well-being is acquired. It's learned, in other words, the result of external environmental influences as well as internal psychological factors. In other words, to a very large extent, resources for happiness can be developed, which gives us a tremendous power right inside the 1.5 kilos of tofu-like tissue inside the coconut that we can use for our own welfare and that of other people. Given this fact, the question naturally arises, how can we increase the acquisition, the learning of mental resources for happiness? Answering this question takes us to the nervous system, since durable, stable psychological resources, capabilities, and tendencies must be embedded in some way in the nervous system, in the body, headquartered in the brain. For example, this is a study from Harvard, Sarah Lazar and her colleagues on longtime mindfulness meditators, and they found that the brains, particularly the cortices, the outer layer of neurons in the brain, are measurably thicker in longtime meditators in 3 key regions, notably the insula, which is involved with tuning into ourselves, a muscle that's routinely worked by people who do some kind of contemplative practice. Second major region, right behind the forehead, prefrontal regions, were measurably thicker in terms of cortex. These are regions that are involved with the regulation of attention, emotion, and action. Also a muscle, as it were, that's exercised when you routinely do some form of contemplative practice. And then last, there was a little bit of benefit to longtime meditators in somatosensory regions on the top of the brain because they repeatedly tuned into their body. The point is that these changes, here we go, in our inner resources, including embedded in changes in neural structure and function, these changes occur in 2 stages. First, there must be an encoded pattern of mental neural activity. In other words, an experience. We start with an experience, a state of mind of some kind. To use a metaphor, we get some kind of good song playing inside the inner iPod, or I'm old enough to think about an inner jukebox. Second, this dynamic pattern of mental neural activation must leave a lasting trace behind for learning to occur. There must be consolidation, or I use a more general term, installation of a passing state into a lasting trait, defining traits here fairly broadly. This 2-stage process of learning is summarized in the work from the Canadian psychologist Donald Hebb. Neurons that fire together wire together. In other words, as examples of this 2-stage process, we become more compassionate, let's say, by repeatedly having experiences of compassion, but that's not just enough. We must also, second, internalize those experiences in some way as a lasting change of neural structure or function. Similarly, we become, let's say, more grateful by repeatedly having experiences of gratitude, which then we internalize, we take into ourselves in some way. Or we become more resilient by repeatedly having experiences of resilience or related factors like determination, or emotional balance, or mindfulness, or a sense of connection with other people. And then, over time, we take those experiences into us. Okay, so then, on this foundation, basic understanding, the question then becomes, how can we increase the acquisition of psychological resources for happiness? How can we steepen personal growth curves? The short answer is, we must focus on the second installation phase of learning. As an individual, as well as a psychologist, a neuropsychologist, teacher, a business consultant, a mindfulness meditation teacher, and maybe most important of all, as a parent, it's been humbling and troubling to face the fact that most of the beneficial, useful thoughts and feelings we have wash through the brain like water through a sieve. They may be momentarily enjoyable, they may be momentarily useful, but there is no lasting learning, no lasting healing, development, or growth. And meanwhile, due to the brain's evolved negativity bias, our painful, stressful, harmful experiences are caught in that sieve and rapidly consolidated in the brain. This negativity bias developed to help our ancestors survive under very harsh conditions, in which threatening or painful experiences usually had more urgency and impact for survival than did hopeful or pleasurable ones. This hardwired negativity bias operates today, right now, in my brain and other brains in this room, in 5 basic ways. The brain routinely scans for bad news, out in the world, and in the body, and in the mind. Once it finds that bad news, we over-focus upon it, and then third, overreact to it, and then fourth, fast-track that whole package into emotional memory. For example, imagine 10 things happen in a day in an important relationship, 9 are positive, 1 is negative. What's the one you think about as you're falling asleep? You get a job review. Your boss gives you 10 pieces of input. 9 are positive, 1 is room for improvement. What's the one we obsess about for the rest of the day? That's the negativity bias at work. And then last, due to the negativity bias, painful, harmful experiences gradually sensitize the brain to stress and negative emotions in a vicious cycle. In a sense, the brain is like Velcro for the bad, but Teflon for the good. This creates a kind of bottleneck in the brain for learning and healing and growth. In essence, we've got a brain that is very good at learning from bad experiences, but relatively bad at learning from good experiences. Even though learning from good experiences of psychological resources, which are usually mildly enjoyable at least, is the primary way to acquire those resources for lasting happiness. And meanwhile, this internalization of negative experiences and our growing sensitization to them remodels the brain in harmful ways, including atrophy and deterioration of function in the prefrontal cortex, right behind the forehead, and the hippocampus, 2 critically important parts of the brain. And over time, there is a sensitization of the alarm bell of the brain, the amygdala, which increases our reactivity to stress, further damaging the brain in a vicious cycle. I'm asserting here that professionals and policymakers, including myself frankly, have not emphasized enough the critically important second stage of learning, the conversion from state to trait. We're good at having useful experiences, we're good at evoking or inducing them in other people. I say this pretty generally, but I think we haven't put enough attention on the second phase of learning. And as an example of the consequences of too often simply assuming that if we help people to have useful experiences in our training programs, psychotherapy office, in informal settings in everyday life, if we just throw some of that mud on the wall, some of it will stick. For example, in my own field of clinical psychology, as a generalization about the average response to treatment, I'm sure with many important exceptions, the average response to treatment in psychotherapy in America at least has been essentially flat for 30 years. While we may have gotten better at activating beneficial experiences in people, I don't think we have gotten particularly better at turning those experiences into lasting healing and growth. And in my fairly long experience in this area at this point, I think that is the fundamental weakness, that's the bottleneck in most interventions to increase human happiness. And therefore, this gives us the fundamental opportunity to help people get more out of the experiences they are already having. in both formal settings such as human resources training, mindfulness classes, and so forth, as well as in the informal settings of everyday life, in order to develop more of the internal resources that foster a durable core happiness. We can think about this opportunity in terms of 4 kinds of lives. Schematic illustration here, in which we see the development of mental resources over time. In the first line here, over a year or a day or an entire lifespan, we see a straight line sloping downward, linear decline, a person who is increasingly less internally resourced over time. In a second life, there could be a flat line, no growth, no psychological development, not getting worse, but not getting better. Third, in this third illustrative life, this person is acquiring inner resources, inner strengths of various kinds, at a steady rate. And then fourth, this person is having an increasing rate of gains over time. This person is learning how to learn, meta-learning, getting better at getting better, a steepening learning curve over the course of life. As clinicians, scientists, educators, policymakers, and perhaps as parents, what can we do to steepen individual learning curves? In other words, how can we maximize the conversion rate from beneficial states to beneficial traits? 3 kinds of factors have been shown to do this, to increase the learning from experiences in both formal and informal settings. Environmental factors, for example, include the setting and social support. Behavioral factors include the activities a person is doing, such as watching a video or reading a book, doing something on their own or in a group of other people, and other variables such as repetition. And then there is the third category, mental factors, that include the motivation and engagement of a person. All these factors are important. It's not either or. Sometimes people set up these false dichotomies. I'm going to focus on mental factors here, though, and I do in general in my work, because mental factors, in general, are most under a person's direct volitional control. And mental factors, we take them with us wherever we go. They are most generalizable across various settings and different targets of healing and growth. As people develop and use mental factors that turbocharge their healing and growth, in effect they are learning how to learn. And as we've seen, happiness depends greatly on internal psychological resources. Not entirely, but it's a major category of factors certainly. And increasing the acquisition of these internal psychological resources depends greatly on people getting better at the second installation phase of learning. To put it succinctly, teaching learning factors increases psychological resources, which increases happiness. To teach learning factors to clinicians, policymakers, and the public, I use a 4-step framework with the acronym HEAL. They told me I could get practical here, so that's what I'm going to do. So, first, we must begin with a beneficial experience. I don't know if you've seen the movie The Matrix, the character Neo, they stick a cable in the back of his head and suddenly he can fly a helicopter, do kung fu, other kinds of things. We don't have that technology, thank goodness in my view. We actually have to start with an experience. The brain is kind of old school, all right? A thought, a perception, an emotion, a desire or action, or a blend of these, an experience that can help develop a psychological resource. Much of the time, we're just noticing what is already happening. We're just simply recognizing an experience that's already occurring, such as a sense of determination, endurance, emotional balance, patience, or other aspect of resilience that's already happening. And also, as a major form of coping and resourcing oneself for mental health, we can deliberately create some useful beneficial experiences, such as calling up a sense of fortitude to meet a challenge. This is the first activation phase of learning. It is necessary for learning, but it is not sufficient. For learning to occur, there must also be installation in the brain, which has 2 aspects. The first aspect of installation is enriching the experience, helping it be big and powerful through a variety of means, including keeping the experience going, intensifying it, feeling it in the body, exploring it, recognizing what might be novel or fresh about it. The brain is a big novelty detector. Or recognizing why it is personally important, why it is relevant or salient. We don't need to do all of these things. The more the better. These are the factors of enriching. And then we have the second aspect of installation, absorbing the experience. Through intending and sensing that the enriched experience is sinking in, and through focusing on what is rewarding about it, the memory-making processes, the memory-making machinery of the nervous system are primed and sensitized, becoming more efficient and effective at internalizing the experience as a lasting change of neural structure and function. These three steps, which are really the essence of learning, the essential process of learning, can be likened to a fire. In the first step, have fire, we notice that there's a fire burning, or we light the fire. Good. Second, enriching, we protect the fire. We don't just skitter on to the next thing, maybe with some of our smartphone devices, and we add fuel to the fire so it burns ever more brightly. And in the third aspect of learning, absorbing, we receive the warmth of the fire, the benefits of this experience into ourselves. And then there is the fourth optional step in the essence of learning, linking positive and negative material in the mind while keeping the positive more prominent, more in the foreground of awareness. For example, let's take a man. A man might feel bad about being criticized by a boss. I've had that experience. That's the negative material, feeling bad, inadequate, unjustly criticized, whatever might be present. And then that, let's say man, let's say myself, could bring to mind people who do appreciate his work, as well as the perspective that he can learn from the experience with his boss and do better next time. With a sense of the positive material, that's the positive material, easing, reducing, and even replacing the negative material. Since neurons that fire together, quote unquote, neurons that fire together wire together, the positive material associates with the negative material. Then, when the negative material must be reconsolidated in a very dynamic, changeable kind of process, reconsolidated back into memory stores, the negative material takes with it some of these positive associations. Taken together, these four steps, good, give us the acronym HEAL. You can recognize these steps, having, enriching, absorbing, and linking, or aspects of them in many informal and formal methods or programs for promoting mental health. I did not invent any of this. I've simply tried to think about them in a comprehensive and applied sort of way. These steps are not exotic, they're not esoteric, it is natural to use them. But in general, in my experience and observation, it is rare to find any sort of explicit, systematic guidance in the application of these steps in opportunities for personal healing, learning, development, and growth. There are definitely some significant exceptions to that, but as a general rule, it's rare to find any systematic, explicit, comprehensive training in the learning factors that steepen individual learning curves as we go over the course of life. While there are many details, many practical applications related to what we've been exploring, which might be called experiential gain theory, the essence really is simple. Have it, get that beneficial experience going, get that song playing in the mind, and then second, in the installation phase, enjoy it. Turn on the inner recorder to install that experience, helping it sink in to become a lasting part of the nervous system. This is why I think that focusing on learning factors is such an opportunity for increasing resilience, well-being, and happiness. As I finish up here, I would like to touch briefly upon two related ideas. The first is that we can apply these general methods that I've covered so far to growing specific, particular psychological resources that are matched to the specific external challenges or internal issues that a person might have. To identify and to grow the psychological resources best matched to individual needs, I use as a framework, as a kind of map, the three-stage, loosely, evolution of the brain, with its more or less reptilian brainstem, mammalian subcortex, I'm simplifying a bit here for the experts in the room, and primate human cortex. These three levels of the brain are loosely related to the fulfillment of our three fundamental needs, very broadly defined. Our needs for safety, for satisfaction, and for connection. This gives us a kind of map, therefore. When one sees that a patient, a client, a student, someone who works with us, a friend, perhaps a child, or citizens or the public in general, have significant unmet needs in a particular area, then one can identify the psychological resources, the inner strengths, that would be particularly helpful for those needs, and then create opportunities to have and to internalize experiences of those resources in order to develop them. For example, let's take the need for safety, probably our most fundamental need of all. It's said that in the wild, rule one is to eat lunch today, don't be lunch today. So in terms of safety, if a person is grappling, let's say, with anxiety, anger, or feelings of helplessness, all indicators of unmet needs for safety, then it would be especially useful to have and then to internalize, to install repeated experiences of sturdiness, determination, and calm strength matched to the unmet need. Then, in terms of the last idea I'd like to touch on here as I finish, it's that focusing on the learning factors that develop durable psychological resources has large-scale implications for nations and for the human species altogether. When any animal, including a big, sophisticated human animal, has an internal sense of deficit or disturbance regarding any one of its three primary needs, that triggers a drive state with associated negative emotions. In other words, for example, we would feel fear and anger when we feel unsafe, or we would experience frustration, disappointment, or drivenness when our need for satisfaction is not experienced as being met. And we might feel lonely or aggressive when our needs for healthy, safe, wholesome connections with others are not being taken care of. The key point here is what does a person experience inside? As many other speakers have talked about very eloquently, it's only half the issue, really, to improve external conditions. We also need to improve the internal landscape. As an American and as someone who grew up in Southern California, very close to Hollywood, it's very clear that affluence alone is not enough, really, to produce or to enable lasting well-being and happiness. This, in a sense, when we're in this drive state, we're triggered, we have a sense of unmet needs. This is the Stone Age brain in the 21st century, tipped into what others and I have called its reactive setting, or I informally call the red zone. While red zone reactivation is normal and can be useful under certain conditions, when it's combined with the brain's negativity bias, the sense of stress and upset, red zone reactivation is the source of much unnecessary suffering, healthcare costs, absenteeism, and poor performance at work and interpersonal problems. And I'm sure it's pretty obvious today, and at the level of groups, organizations, races and religions, and nations. Red zone brain reactivation, based on an underlying felt sense of deficit and disturbance in terms of fundamental needs, something missing, something wrong, is the source of much tension and conflict and even war. But when people repeatedly internalize genuine experiences of basic needs met, experiences of safety, satisfaction, and connection. Things need not be perfect, but in a core sense, in a basic sense, there's a feeling of enoughness and balance. This builds up through repeated internalization, repeated installation, internal resources of calm strength for safety, gratitude and contentment for satisfaction, and compassion and confidence for connection. And when people do this, they hardwire into their nervous systems an increasingly unconditional core sense of fullness and balance, not so much based on external conditions, but they carry it with them wherever they go, rather than deficit and disturbance. This has been termed the responsive setting of the brain, or what I call the green zone. This internal sense of fullness and balance is the neuropsychological foundation of lasting happiness. And with this stable internal core, a kind of green zone brain, people are much less prone to and much less easily manipulated by, in terms of our three basic needs, fear and anger in terms of safety, greed and possessiveness in terms of satisfaction, and us against them, conflicts in terms of connection. If a critical mass of people could develop this internalized, stable core of well-being, hardwired into their own nervous system, personally, with some humility here, I'd like to offer the thought that this just might help change the course of human history and perhaps help our planet come to a softer landing than the one it is heading toward. Or, as the Chinese sage Lao Tzu summed up poetically, keep a green bough in your heart and a singing bird will come. Thank you.